The Saturday afternoon sun hung lazily over Riverside Park, casting long shadows across the basketball court where a teenage boy dribbled his worn ball against the smooth concrete. The rhythmic bounce echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a sound that had become part of the park's weekend symphony for the past 3 years. He moved with natural grace, each shot precise and practiced. Basketball wasn't just a game for him, it was his weekend ritual, his way of unwinding after long hours of studying. His report card, filled with A's and B's, was proudly displayed on his family's refrigerator, right next to the newspaper clipping about his mother's historic election victory. The newly installed benches around the court sat empty, except for his water bottle and a light blue hoodie he'd shed as the afternoon had grown warmer. The spring air carried the scent of blooming cherry blossoms, and somewhere nearby, children's laughter floated from the playground. From her recently purchased townhouse overlooking the park, a woman stood at her window, coffee cup in hand. She'd moved to the neighborhood just 2 months ago, drawn by the promises of exclusive community living and pristine public spaces. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the young man on the court. She'd been observing him for the past 20 minutes, her mind racing with assumptions. The teen, completely unaware of being watched, continued his practice. He was working on his three-pointers, something he hoped would impress the varsity coach next season. Each shot was followed by a small victory smile or a determined head shake, depending on whether the ball swished through the net or bounced off the rim. The park had always been a safe space, a place where neighborhood kids could be themselves. The old maple trees that lined the court had witnessed countless games, friendly matches, and impromptu tournaments. Today, they would witness something entirely different. Setting down her coffee cup with a sharp clink, the woman made her decision. She smoothed her designer blouse, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and grabbed her phone. Her heels clicked purposefully against the sidewalk as she made her way down to the park, her shoulders squared with misplaced conviction. The sound of her approaching footsteps finally caught the boy's attention. He caught his ball mid-dribble and turned, offering a polite smile, the same one he gave to all his neighbors. But something in the woman's expression made his smile fade slightly. Her face was set in stern lines, her phone clutched tightly in her manicured hands. Little did either of them know that this moment would soon explode beyond their quiet corner of the park. The trees, the court, the warm spring air, all these familiar elements were about to become the backdrop for a story that would shake their community to its core and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and power. In the distance, a city hall office phone would soon start ringing, and a mother would have to shift from reviewing policy documents to protecting her child. But for now, on this basketball court, two people stood facing each other, one filled with unfounded suspicion, the other with growing unease, as the afternoon sun continued its lazy descent over Riverside Park. "Excuse me," the woman's voice cut through the peaceful afternoon air. "Do you live around here?" Her tone carried that particular edge that made it clear this wasn't just friendly neighborhood chat. The teen lowered his basketball, tucking it against his hip. He'd been taught to always be respectful to adults, even when they weren't showing the same courtesy. "Yes, ma'am," he replied simply, gesturing vaguely toward the row of houses beyond the park. "I live just over there." "I'm going to need to see some proof of residence," she declared, lifting her chin slightly. Her designer sunglasses reflected the basketball court, making her expression hard to read. "I'm part of the neighborhood watch, and I haven't seen you around before." The boy's heart began to race, but his voice remained steady. "Ma'am, this is a public park. I've been playing basketball here every weekend for the past 3 years." He could feel his palms getting sweaty against the ball's rough surface. A couple walking their golden retriever slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. The woman noticed them, but seemed to take their presence as an encouragement. "Well, if you live here, it shouldn't be a problem to prove it," she pressed, taking a step closer. "I'm just trying to keep our neighborhood safe." The boy took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words about staying calm in difficult situations. I'm a student at the high school, he explained patiently. I play varsity basketball. A lot of people here know me. I don't carry ID while I'm playing basketball. More people were starting to notice now. An elderly man tending to his garden across the street straightened up, watching with concern. A group of kids on bikes slowed their riding to observe the situation. If you can't prove you belong here, then I'm going to have to ask you to leave, the woman stated firmly, her phone now raised slightly. Or I'll need to call someone who can sort this out. The teen felt a mix of emotions wash over him: frustration, anger, hurt, but he kept his composure. Ma'am, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just playing basketball in a public park on a Saturday afternoon. A younger woman, pushing a stroller, stopped nearby, pulling out her phone. Hey, buddy, she called out to the teen. Aren't you Mrs. J's son? From Oak Street? Her voice was kind, offering support. But the first woman wasn't deterred. I don't care who his mother is. If he lives here, he needs to prove it. Her fingers were already tapping at her phone screen. I'm calling the police. This is exactly why we need to protect our community. The teen's shoulders slumped slightly, but he stood his ground. More neighbors were gathering now, their faces showing a mix of concern and disbelief. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. The afternoon has shifted from peaceful to tense in a matter of minutes. Listen, the teen tried one more time, his voice clear and composed despite the situation. I understand you're concerned about the neighborhood. But what you're doing right now, this isn't right, and I think you know that. The woman had already raised her phone to her ear, turning slightly away from the growing crowd. Yes, hello. I'd like to report a suspicious person at Riverside Park. Her voice carried across the now quiet basketball court. The teen looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some familiar, some not, and saw the range of emotions playing across them. This moment, he realized, was bigger than just him and this woman. It was about something that happened far too often in far too many places. In the distance, a siren wailed. But another sound was approaching too, the distinctive rumble of a city vehicle's engine. Within minutes, this situation would take a turn that nobody, especially the woman with the phone, could have anticipated. The woman's voice trembled with artificial concern as she spoke into her phone. Yes, I'm at Riverside Park, and there's someone here who's making me feel very uncomfortable. She turned her back to the growing crowd, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent others from hearing. He's refusing to show ID, and I'm worried about the safety of our neighborhood. A collective murmur of disapproval rippled through the gathering of neighbors. The teen stood quietly, still holding his basketball, watching as phones recorded the scene. The afternoon sun caught the sweat on his forehead, no longer from playing basketball, but from the stress of the situation. He's tall, the woman continued her description to dispatch, carefully choosing her words while throwing occasional glances over her shoulder. He's wearing athletic clothes. No, he hasn't threatened me, but he won't leave when asked. She paused, listening to the dispatcher's questions. Yes, I'll stay on the line until officers arrive. The elderly man who had been gardening across the street made his way over, leaning on his cane. Young man, he called out, his voice carrying the weight of years, you keep right on playing. My grandkids play with you all the time. This is ridiculous. More neighbors chimed in, their voices creating a protective chorus around the teen. A woman who taught at the elementary school stepped forward. I've seen you helping the younger kids with their basketball moves, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. You've been nothing but a positive presence in this park. The woman with the phone shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on with her call. Yes, there are other people here now, but they don't understand the situation. Her voice had taken on a defensive edge. I'm new to the neighborhood, and I'm just trying to ensure proper security measures are followed. 2 police cars pulled up to the park entrance, their lights flashing but sirens silent. The crowd parted as 2 officers approached, their faces professional but showing hints of recognition as they surveyed the scene. They'd been to this park many times before, for community events, for friendly chats with residents, but never for something like this. "Ma'am," the first officer addressed the woman, "we received your call about a suspicious person." His tone was neutral, practiced. The second officer stood slightly back, taking in the scene and the number of phones recording the interaction. The woman straightened her designer blouse, gaining confidence from the officer's presence. "Yes, I found this person using our park facilities, and he refuses to prove he's a resident." She gestured toward the teen with her manicured hand. "I'm just doing my civic duty." The first officer turned to the teen, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the distinctive sound of another vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention. The heavy purr of a government-issue SUV engine cut through the tense atmosphere. The crowd turned toward the sound, and several people's expressions shifted from concern to something like satisfaction. The woman with the phone was still talking, explaining her version of events to the officers, unaware that the situation was about to change dramatically. "This is a members-only community," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "We have rules here about who can use these facilities." She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed both officers' attention had shifted to something, or someone, behind her. The black SUV pulled up smoothly to the curb, its official city plates gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The engine shut off, and for a moment, there was complete silence in the park. The woman finally turned around, her phone still pressed to her ear, as the car door opened. The teen, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, allowed himself a small smile. He knew that sound, that car, those plates, and in just a few seconds, everyone else would understand exactly why trying to kick him out of his neighborhood park had been a very, very big mistake. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the basketball court as more neighbors arrived at the scene, drawn by messages and calls spreading through the community. Parents with children, joggers who had stopped mid-run, and elderly residents who rarely ventured out all gathered to witness what was unfolding. "That's the boy who helped my son with his homework last week," one mother whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "He tutors kids at the community center." Her young son nodded vigorously, clutching his mother's hand and waving at the teen with his free one. The woman who had made the call was still standing near the officers, but her confidence seemed to waver as she noticed familiar faces in the crowd giving her disapproving looks. Her phone was now lowered to her side, the call to dispatch apparently forgotten. "I've got it all on video," announced a college student who lived in the apartment complex across the street. She held up her phone, its camera still recording. "Been filming since she first started harassing him." Several other phones were raised in agreement, their cameras capturing every moment. The teen's basketball lay forgotten on the court now, having rolled away when the police arrived. A young girl, no more than 7, broke away from her father's grip, chased after the ball, and brought it back to the teen. "Here you go," she said with a smile. "I saw you teaching my brother how to shoot hoops last weekend." The woman's face flushed as she'd heard these testimonials. She turned to the officers, trying to maintain her composure. "I still haven't seen any proof that he lives here," she insisted, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. The first officer cleared his throat, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He'd been about to speak when the second officer touched his arm and nodded toward the city vehicle that had just arrived. Something in their expressions suggested they knew exactly what was coming. A retired teacher who lived on the corner stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent in classrooms. "Young man," she called out, "didn't I see you at the honor roll ceremony last month?" The teen nodded politely, maintaining his dignified silence. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, forming a loose circle around the scene. Some were streaming the incident live on their phones, others were texting rapidly, and a few were making calls. "You need to see what's happening at the park," one resident spoke into his phone. "Remember that discussion about profiling at the last town meeting? Well, through it all, The teen maintained his composure, standing tall but relaxed, his hands open at his sides. He'd been taught how to handle situations like this, though he never thought he'd need those lessons in his own neighborhood, at his own park. The sound of a car door opening cut through the murmurs of the crowd. The woman turned toward the noise, still clutching her phone like a lifeline. The sun glinted off the city seal on the black SUV's door, and the crowd fell silent in anticipation. "That's it," a voice from the crowd whispered, barely containing their excitement. "Now she's going to learn who she really called the police on." The woman squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out the figure emerging from the official vehicle. Her expression shifted from righteous indignation to uncertainty as she noticed the crowd's reaction. Some were smiling now, others were shaking their heads, and a few were even chuckling quietly. The teen took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders slightly. He hadn't wanted this kind of attention, hadn't asked for this confrontation, but now that it was happening, he knew it might serve a greater purpose. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful lessons come from unexpected moments like these. The clicking of heels on pavement signaled the approach of someone from the city vehicle. The crowd parted respectfully, creating a path toward the basketball court, where everything had started just an hour ago. The woman's hand finally dropped her phone completely as realization began to dawn on her face. The next few moments would change not just the afternoon, but potentially the entire community's future. And it all started with a simple game of basketball on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The click of heels against pavement grew louder as the figure from the city vehicle approached. The mayor walked with purpose, dressed casually in weekend clothes, a stark contrast to her usual formal attire seen on the local news. Her face showed concern rather than anger, though her eyes held a determined glint that every city council member had learned to recognize. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice carrying naturally across the now quiet basketball court. The two police officers immediately straightened their postures, nodding respectfully. "Officer Chen, Officer Rodriguez. I believe I saw you both at last week's community safety meeting." The woman who had made the call stood frozen, her designer sunglasses now clutched in her trembling hands. The mayor's presence was unexpected enough, but what happened next left her completely speechless. "Mom," the teen said quietly, relief barely visible in his composed expression. "I was just playing basketball." The simplicity of his statement hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of the situation that had unfolded. A collective gasp rose from those in the crowd who hadn't already known, followed by murmurs and a few satisfied nods. The mayor stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her son's shoulder before addressing the gathering. "I was in my office, finishing up some weekend paperwork," she began, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of purpose, "when I started receiving messages about an incident at our neighborhood park." She looked around the crowd, acknowledging the many phones still recording. "At first, I was going to handle this as the mayor, but then I recognized the description of the young man in question." The woman who had called the police shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence completely deflated. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You see," the mayor continued, "this park holds special meaning for our family. My son has been playing basketball here since we moved to this neighborhood 6 years ago. Before I was mayor, before I was even on the city council, we chose this community because of places like this, public spaces where everyone belongs." Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. The elderly gardener who had defended the teen earlier called out, "He helps me with my yard work sometimes, Madam Mayor. Fine young man you've raised." The mayor smiled warmly at the comment before turning her attention to the woman who had made the call. "I understand you're new to our community," she said, her tone remaining professional but warm. "Moving to a new place can be challenging. We all want to feel safe in our neighborhoods." She paused, letting her words sink in. The woman's face had turned a deep shade of red, her eyes fixed on the ground. "But safety," the mayor continued, "isn't about assuming the worst in people. It's about building connections, understanding our neighbors, and recognizing that our community's strength comes from our diversity, not from exclusion. The police officers, who had been standing quietly, began to shift their weight. The senior officer spoke up. "Madam Mayor, do you want us to?" "No need for any official action," she interrupted gently. "I believe this can be a learning moment for all of us." She turned back to address the whole crowd. "What happened here today isn't unique to our community. It happens across our country, every day. But how we respond, that's what defines us." The teen picked up his basketball, which had rolled near his feet. His mother gave his shoulder a squeeze before addressing the crowd one final time. "I'd like to invite everyone, including our newest resident," she gestured toward the woman who had made the call, "to next week's community forum. We'll be discussing how to build a more inclusive neighborhood, one where every resident feels safe, and where playing basketball on a Saturday afternoon doesn't trigger assumptions based on appearance." The woman finally looked up, meeting the mayor's eyes for the first time. In that moment, the weight of her actions seemed to hit her fully, along with the realization that this incident would have repercussions far beyond this afternoon at the park. The tension in the air shifted as the woman who had made the call finally found her voice. I had no idea," she stammered, her perfectly manicured hands fidgeting with her phone. "Madam Mayor, I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I didn't mean to—" Her voice trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. The mayor's response was measured, her years of handling delicate situations evident in her tone. "Let's talk about what protecting the neighborhood really means," she said, gesturing to one of the park benches. "Would you join me for a moment?" The crowd watched as both women moved to the bench, the mayor's casual weekend attire a stark contrast to the other woman's designer outfit. The teen resumed his basketball practice, the familiar sound of the ball hitting concrete breaking the uncomfortable silence. 6 years ago, the mayor began, loud enough for nearby observers to hear, "When we first moved here, someone called the police on my son too." She paused, watching her son sink a perfect three-pointer. "The difference is, I wasn't mayor then. I was just another concerned mother trying to explain to my child why someone thought he didn't belong in his own neighborhood." The woman's face crumpled slightly, her earlier defensiveness melting into genuine shame. "I never thought. I just moved here because it was supposed to be a good neighborhood." "And what makes a neighborhood good?" the mayor asked, not unkindly. "Is it the property values, the fancy gates? Or is it the people who help their elderly neighbors with yard work? The teens who tutor younger kids? The families who look out for each other?" Nearby, a group of children had started their own basketball game, inspired by the teens' return to practice. Their laughter floated across the court, a reminder of what the park was meant to be, a place for community, not confrontation. "But the crime reports in this area," the woman began, then stopped herself, realizing how her words might sound. The mayor nodded understandingly. "I have access to those reports. Would you like to know what the biggest complaints in our neighborhood are? Unleashed dogs and incorrect recycling bin usage." She smiled slightly. "My son has been playing basketball here every weekend for years. He's never been the problem. The problem was the assumption you made when you saw him." The woman wiped at her eyes, smearing her carefully applied mascara. "I've made a horrible mistake, haven't I?" "Mistakes are how we learn," the mayor replied, reaching into her casual jacket's pocket and pulling out a business card. "Next Tuesday, I'm hosting a community meeting at City Hall. We're discussing plans for updating the park. We could use input from new residents, especially those who care about neighborhood safety." The police officers, who had been standing quietly nearby, began to make their way back to their vehicles. One of them called out, "See you at the youth basketball program next weekend, champ." The teen waved in response, a small smile playing at his lips. The crowd had started to disperse, though many lingered, phones still recording this unexpected turn of events. The woman stared at the business card in her hands, then looked up at the park around her, really seeing it for the first time. Children playing, neighbors chatting, a community existing in harmony until she had disrupted it with her assumptions. The hardest part of leading a city, the mayor said, standing up from the bench, isn't managing budgets or overseeing departments. It's helping people understand that a community's strength comes from its ability to welcome everyone, not its ability to keep people out. The woman stood too, clutching the business card like a lifeline. "Will your son be at the meeting too?" she asked hesitantly. "He never misses a community meeting," the mayor replied. "He says he wants to learn how to make a difference." She paused, watching her son help a younger child with their basketball stance. "Though I'd say he's already figuring that out pretty well on his own." By Monday morning, the video of the park incident had spread throughout the city. Local news vans lined the street outside City Hall, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. The mayor's office phone rang continuously as reporters sought comments about what had happened. Inside her office, the mayor sat with her son, both still processing the weekend's events. "The video has over 100,000 views," he said, scrolling through his phone. "People are sharing their own similar stories in the comments." A gentle knock on the door interrupted them. The mayor's assistant poked her head in. "Ma'am, every seat for tomorrow's town hall is reserved. We're setting up overflow rooms with video feeds. And," she hesitated, "the woman from the park is here. She's asking to speak with you." The teen looked up from his phone. "Mom, maybe this is a chance to turn this whole thing into something positive." The woman who entered the office looked different from the person who had made that call 2 days ago. Her designer clothes were replaced by simple business attire, her face free of makeup, her eyes showing signs of sleepless nights. "I've been reading the comments on the videos," she said quietly, placing a folder on the mayor's desk. "I had no idea how many people go through this kind of thing. I've written a public apology, but—" She took a deep breath. "I want to do more than just say sorry." The mayor opened the folder, finding a detailed proposal for a neighborhood inclusion initiative. "You put this together over the weekend." "I used to work in corporate training before moving here," the woman explained. "I've outlined a program to help new residents understand community values and recognize their own biases. I'd like to fund it personally." The teen leaned forward, interested. "Like an orientation program?" "More than that," the woman replied, turning to him. "I'd want to create opportunities for real connections. Weekend sports programs, community dinners, cultural exchange events. Things that bring people together instead of keeping them apart." As they discussed the proposal, social media continued to buzz. Local community groups shared positive stories about the teen. His volunteer work at the library, his tutoring sessions with younger kids, his help with elderly neighbors' yard work. The narrative was shifting from outrage to inspiration. The local high school principal called, requesting permission to use the incident as a teaching moment in their social studies classes. The Parks Department reported a surge in requests for basketball court renovations across the city. Even the police department announced plans to enhance their community engagement programs. By Tuesday evening, the town hall meeting had become standing room only. People spilled into hallways, their voices a quiet murmur of anticipation. The woman who had made the call sat in the front row, her proposal clutched in slightly trembling hands. The mayor stood at the podium, her son beside her, facing a sea of faces that represented every part of their diverse community. "What happened in our park this weekend," she began, "could have torn us apart. Instead, it's bringing us together." She gestured to the woman in the front row. "Change starts with admitting our mistakes and working to do better. Tonight, we're going to hear a proposal for a new community initiative. But more importantly, we're going to have an honest conversation about who we are as a community and who we want to be." The teen stepped up to the microphone. His voice was steady as he shared his experience, not just from the weekend, but from years of similar assumptions and encounters. But instead of anger, he spoke of hope. "Every time something like this happens," he said, "we have a choice. We can let it divide us, or we can use it to understand each other better. Local business owners raised their hands, offering to sponsor community events. Religious leaders proposed interfaith dialogues. School teachers suggested student exchange programs between different neighborhoods. What had started as a moment of prejudice was transforming into a catalyst for change. Outside City Hall, the evening news crews captured the overflow crowd spilling onto the steps, their faces animated with discussion and purpose. The story they would tell tonight wouldn't be about conflict, but about a community choosing to grow stronger together. 1 month after the park incident, the community center buzzed with activity. The woman who had made that fateful call stood at the front of a packed room, sharing her story with a group of new residents. Her designer clothes were replaced by a casual community volunteer t-shirt, her once perfect manicure now showing signs of hands-on community work. "I thought I was protecting my neighborhood," she told the group, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "Instead, I was the one who needed to learn what community really means." She gestured to the teen who sat in the back of the room, helping younger children with their homework. My teacher turned out to be the very person I wrongly judged. The room was filled with faces representing every part of their diverse community. Some were longtime residents, others had just moved in. All were there for the first session of the new neighborhood welcome program. "Last month, I made a mistake that went viral," she continued, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. "But instead of running away from the embarrassment, I decided to learn from it." The screen showed a photo of the basketball court, now featuring a freshly painted mural celebrating community unity. The mayor's son stood up, joining her at the front. "When my mom suggested I help with these sessions, I wasn't sure," he admitted to the group. "But then I realized. Change happens when people are willing to have uncomfortable conversations." Together, they led the group through exercises designed to challenge assumptions and build connections. People shared stories about their first days in the neighborhood, their fears, their hopes. Laughter mixed with serious discussion as strangers became neighbors. Outside the community center windows, kids played basketball on the court where it all began. The police officers who had responded that day were there too, not in uniform, but in casual clothes, teaching young children how to dribble. "The hardest part," the woman explained, addressing a question from the audience, "was watching myself in those viral videos. Seeing my own prejudice displayed so publicly was devastating. But it also forced me to confront beliefs I didn't even know I had." The teen added his perspective. What made the difference was what happened after. Instead of just apologizing, she asked how she could help make real change. During the break, people clustered in small groups, sharing snacks and stories. A retired teacher talked about witnessing similar incidents in her classroom years ago. A young couple who had just moved in shared their anxieties about fitting in. The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. The mayor arrived later, slipping quietly into the back of the room. She watched as her son demonstrated a trust-building exercise with the woman who had once called the police on him. Their interaction was natural now, the tension of that day replaced by a shared purpose. "Our next session will be a community dinner," the woman announced, showing the schedule. "Everyone brings a dish that tells a story about their family, because understanding each other starts with sharing our stories." As the session wound down, participants lingered, exchanging phone numbers and making plans to meet again. The woman who had once stood in her window judging others now stood in a circle of new friends, planning neighborhood cleanup projects and youth mentoring programs. The teen gathered his tutoring materials, high-fiving the kids he'd been helping. "See you at basketball practice this weekend?" Several of them asked eagerly. He nodded, catching his mother's proud smile from across the room. The woman approached them both as people were leaving. "I never thought my biggest mistake would lead to my most important work," she said, emotion making her voice slightly shaky. "Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right." The mayor put an arm around her son's shoulders. "Sometimes," she replied, "the best leaders are the ones who learn from their mistakes and help others avoid making the same ones." As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the community center windows, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the room. On the wall, a new banner hung proudly. Our strength is our diversity. Building community one story at a time. 6 months after the park incident, the neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The basketball court where it all began was now the heart of a thriving community hub. On this particular Saturday morning, the woman who had made that infamous call was organizing a neighborhood basketball tournament, clipboard in hand, wearing a community coach t-shirt. The teen, now starting his sophomore year, stood beside her, helping pair up teams that mixed longtime residents with newcomers. Remember, he called out to the gathered players, this tournament isn't about winning. It's about building connections. What had started as a viral video of prejudice had sparked something remarkable. The Neighborhood Welcome Program, initially created as a response to the incident, had been adopted by 3 neighboring cities. News crews occasionally still showed up, but now they were covering success stories instead of controversy. The mayor watched from the sidelines as her son refereed a game between elderly residents and middle school students. The older folks weren't very fast, but they made up for it with clever passes and lots of laughing. Every basket was celebrated by both teams, regardless of who scored it. "Did you ever imagine this would be the outcome?" asked a city council member, joining the mayor on the bench. "Sometimes," the mayor replied, watching the woman who had once called the police now cheering for a team of diverse teenagers. "The best changes come from the hardest moments." The community center behind the court had been renovated, its walls now covered with photos of neighborhood events. Potluck dinners where families shared their traditional recipes, weekend workshops where residents taught each other new skills, and youth mentoring sessions led by the teen and his friends. A local business owner approached the mayor, pointing to a group of new residents touring the neighborhood. "Your son's welcome committee is doing amazing work," he said. "Last week, they helped 3 families move in. Did you see the video they made?" The teen had created a short documentary about the neighborhood's transformation, featuring interviews with residents sharing their stories of prejudice, learning, and growth. It had gone viral too, but for all the right reasons this time. Schools across the country were using it in their social studies classes. Near the water fountain, the woman who had made the call stood talking with a new resident who looked nervous about joining the tournament. 6 months ago, I was afraid of people I didn't know, she told him. Now I can't imagine living any other way than being connected to my neighbors. The police officers who had responded that day were regular visitors now, but not for emergencies. They ran a youth sports program on weekends, building trust with the community one game at a time. Today, they were teaching younger kids how to shoot hoops on the practice court. The teens tutoring program had grown into a full-scale mentorship initiative. High school students from across the city came to learn his approach to building bridges between different communities. "It's simple," he told them during training sessions. "Treat every mistake as a chance to learn, and every difference as a chance to grow." As the tournament continued, the mayor's phone buzzed with a message. Another city wanted to implement their community program. She smiled, watching her son help a young player perfect their shooting form. The woman who had once called the police on him was now taking pictures for the community newsletter, documenting the moment with pride. "Mom," the teen called out, waving her over. "We need one more player for the next game. Want to join?" The mayor kicked off her shoes, ready to join the game. Around her, the sounds of laughter, friendly trash talk, and the steady bounce of basketballs filled the air. Children of all backgrounds played together, parents chatted on the sidelines, and elderly residents kept score while sharing stories. The woman who had made the call 6 months ago caught the mayor's eye and smiled. They both knew that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. On the court's backboard, a new sign gleamed in the morning sun. "Everyone belongs here. Building community one game at a time." The basketball that had sparked a controversy now symbolized unity, bouncing from hand to hand, bringing people together instead of driving them apart. This was more than a happy ending. It was a new beginning.